If you're debating the Baltics topic, you're probably either running the Baltic invasion argument on AF, have hit it in round, or are writing blocks to it. Regardless, I'm Serena, and in this video, I'll be giving you a rundown on responding to the Baltic invasion argument on AF, as well as some general responses to the argument on both the AF and the neg. Again, I have all these responses carded and written out, so check the video description if you want free access to that. In this video, I'll also be describing the strengths and weaknesses in each response that I wrote, and that won't be in the prep file, so make sure you're paying attention. First, let's talk about what the argument even is in the first place. The whole idea is that Putin has some specific incentive to invade the Baltics. We'll talk about those specific incentives a little bit later. However, if we put troops in the Baltics, the general idea is that it will deter Russia from attacking, either through deterrence by denial, the tripwire effect, or strengthening the credibility of the alliance. You can ask me to explain this later, but for now, all you need to know is that troops prevent an invasion that supposedly leads to nuclear war or just a big conflict in general. The rest of the video will be structured like this. I'll first give responses to the invasion argument on both the AF and the neg, then proceed to responses to the AF specifically. So to invade the Baltics, Russia needs both the capability and the intent. If Russia is physically incapable of starting war, then the AF has no access to their link. That's why the first response is that STANGL 19 finds that Russia is physically incapable of invading the Baltics because its military is unprepared and underdeveloped to launch a successful invasion. So the issue with this response is that there are a lot of cards saying the exact opposite, but I've seen too many rounds where teams just completely drop this response because it's short and they aren't expecting it. So I think it's just good to read as a short time-sucking response in my opinion. The second response comes from Bandow 17, who finds that the US is bound by treaty to defend the Baltics if attacked, meaning that Russia would have to basically fight the US and it would never invade knowing that the US would win. That's because A, the US spends 10 times more in the military than Russia, and B, Russia's economy is suffering far more than the US's and they can't actually afford a war. So this response is a two-tiered implication, both being primarily based on capability. The idea is that even if Russia wants to invade really badly, Article 5 means that US always comes to the Baltics' defense, preventing Russia from succeeding. At that point, there's no point of invading if it won't work. There's also an additional implication that can be made off the second implication off the economy, which is that Russia physically can't afford or sustain a drawn-out conflict due to its economy. So literally, the war cannot go on for that long because Russia just does not have enough money to do that. The third response also comes from Bandow 17. He adds that neither the US or Russia can afford to allow any conflict to race out of control, proving that either A, the war never happens, or B, that the war is resolved quickly to avoid further damage. So this seems super similar to the previous response, but the difference is that this is incentive-based. In the later half of the round, you need to weigh this incentive against the AF's incentives. For example, if they say that Russia wants access to warm water ports or oil resources, point out that a full-blown war would destroy every sector of the economy as well as physical ports and oil fields, making the costs severely outweigh the benefits. Similarly, if they say that the incentive is to start a diversionary conflict, emphasize that a nuke war would not improve Putin's popularity by much, and in fact would just distract the people's attention to something far worse. Make sure you're actually doing incentive comparison rather than just asserting that Russia has a disincentive and not really weighing it against the AF's incentive. So the fourth top-shelf response comes from ROJANSKY 14, who explains that after Crimea, Russians oppose further military intervention and instead want Putin to focus on the economy. Recently, he writes that Putin has clearly backed off from full-scale invasions, specifically because he knows the Russian public doesn't like it. So this brings a new disincentive into the picture, which is that his citizens don't want it. Now it's even more important to weigh this response against the AF's incentive, since popularity seems to be a much less impactful thing. The argument you should make here is that Putin's main goal is to stay in power, and to do so, he has to do what the people want. Even if he restores Soviet glory or gains economic benefit once he invades, he'll receive massive opposition that threatens his power, which is what he needs to do to literally do anything as a leader. You can also outweigh on the probability front here, because the card literally says that Putin has explicitly backed away from invasions before when his population is opposed, thus using historical precedent to prove your argument. So now let's move on to impact defense. It's super important to be clear on what your opponent's link to war is. Obviously, if it's an intentional nuclear war, MAD pretty much takes the argument out. If it's a miscalculated war, then teams should be putting defense on the internal link, which for some reason I rarely see. So the first piece of impact defense comes from GETZELMAN 21, who finds that the US and Russia have a nuclear hotline that allows for communication and allows them to tell their intentions to one another, thus ensuring that miscalculation doesn't happen. And this has explicitly prevented war on 3 different occasions. Miscalculation fundamentally results from misunderstandings that are ultimately resolved through hotline communications. That means that if both sides communicate their intentions, there is no chance to miscalculate, because the definition of miscalculating is thinking wrongly about what the other side intends to do. There's common responses to this response that countries don't trust each other in a conflict, which is why there's a spike in the response saying that the hotline was actually successfully used 3 times in the past, proving that their front line isn't actually true, and the incentive to avoid war is greater than the incentive to not trust the opponent. So the second response is pretty similar, and it comes from GOWAN, who finds in 2016 that empirically, even when tensions spike with Russia, the US and its allies have found ways to de-escalate tensions with Moscow because it suits all parties to stay at the negotiating table even if mistrust is high, thus always avoiding miscalculation. So this response is slightly different from the previous one in that it's not only applicable to miscalculation. Instead, it uses historical precedent to indicate that whenever conflict has begun to spiral between the US and Russia, it always ultimately de-escalates rather than kind of escalates into whatever war that your opponents talk about. It also includes a spike about mistrust, explaining that mistrust historically actually isn't a barrier to de-escalation. That means the war is ultimately either short or doesn't happen in the first place. So those were all responses to the Russian Baltic invasion argument on both sides, but now we'll move on to specifically responses against the AF invasion argument. The first response here is a loaded turn about sparking an arms race. It comes from GALEN 20, who finds that troops scare Russia into building up their military to restore the same balance, because Russia will match any NATO buildup in the Baltics. This arms race is then bad for 3 reasons. First, Russia isn't deterred because they built up their military as well, and the resulting war is much worse because both sides have way more troops. B, tensions increase the chance of a miscalculation during an arms race, which is why Writer 11 finds the arms races increase the chance of war by 331%. Finally, more military spending means less social spending. Hillary H. quantifies that a 1% increase in military spending is associated with a decrease in growth by 9% over 20 years. The World Bank found in 2007 that a 1% increase in GDP reduces poverty by 1.7%. So before anything else, I just wanted to mention that the GALEN card is super explicit and good in saying that Russia has specifically vowed to reciprocate whenever NATO increases troops, so you don't really have to worry about misconstruing that card. Anyways, this is a really well-implicated response, so let's unpack it. So the first implication is terminal defense against the AF, because if Russia builds up its military as much, if not more, than NATO does, then Russia still holds the same military advantage as before the resolution passed. In turn, that means there's no deterrence because Russia is still that much stronger. So the second implication about arms race leading to war is just another offensive turn. One issue with this is that the writer's card's baseline is 0.01, meaning that this so-called 331% increase is just increasing the probability from 0.01 to 0.03. Finally, there's also another offensive implication off of social spending just in case they frontline arms race. So the only issue here is that you can't really quantify how much social spending decreases, but the fact that you have some offense is basically uncontestable, so it's still easy to win this turn off of probability. So the second top-shelf response on the AF's invasion argument is that the CEIP in 2018 explains that Russia may misinterpret troops on its border as the precursor to a NATO preemptive strike on Russia. In response, Russia would preemptively strike the troops as they are being deployed to neutralize the threat, linking into their nuclear war scenario. This is a short and sweet turn that many teams read as a neg argument that's really damning if teams drop it because the time frame is super immediate and it links directly into their impact. What's important to note is that the evidence says that Russia may interpret and not will interpret, so make sure you aren't misconstruing your evidence. The other issue with this is that it contradicts the miscalculation response, so pick and choose which responses to read. So the last response is a super logical one. It's just that their own war definitely won't be big because their own link is that Russia will only do it if it's quick and easy. Their own empiric about Crimea did not trigger their huge impact. In fact, the RFE in 2019 finds the death toll was in the thousands. That puts them in a double bind because A, if the war is disastrous, then Russia can't use it to distract from domestic issues, but B, if the war is quick and easy, it doesn't trigger the disastrous impact. So this is a really good response to ask us a cross question, because teams will sound super ridiculous defending that Russia would cause billions of deaths to distract from domestic economic issues, or just for the sake of like a few warm water ports. One thing to note is that the RFE card says that 13,000 people died in the Ukraine conflict's aftermath, but to make the number sound a bit smaller, I just cut it as thousands. This is a general trick you can use to make cards prove your point, but in an ethical way. So the first response here is that GZERO21 and KHRUSCHEVA19 writes the diversionary intervention worked before, but now Russians are tired of it, and Putin even had to downplay Crimea because Russians now hate it so much. Russians won't let Putin pull the same trick twice to neglect domestic issues. And you also want to prefer this analysis because Putin would have invaded mid-COVID if AF was right. So this is a really good response because AF usually likes to use Crimea as historical precedent for diversionary wars, and it's proof that Russia would do the same thing again. This response actually turns that analysis against the AF because it explains that the Russian people aren't stupid and they won't let Putin just launch some war to distract them from domestic issues again. In other words, the diversionary war happening previously is a reason why it won't happen again, not the other way around. The second response is that Silver21 writes that if Russia were to launch a diversionary war anywhere, it would definitely be Ukraine instead of the Baltics, as Mars19 elaborates that Russia has redeployed 6 new bases near Ukraine, but has chosen not to modernize Baltic forces. The Wilson Center 16 also confirms that Russia is preparing to escalate in Ukraine and simultaneously literally fire the Baltic Fleet's command. This response is effective because as long as you prove that a Ukraine invasion is more likely than a Baltic invasion, it's terminal defense on their argument because Russia doesn't need 2 diversionary wars. One thing to note is that the evidence about Russia firing the Baltic Fleet is outdated, and there's a decent amount of recent evidence saying that Russia is militarizing in the Baltics. However, it's still worth reading if you have the time, because some teams either just won't have responses or will just waste time frontlining. The third response is along a similar vein as the first one, arguing that Bandow 16 finds that past interventions like Georgia and Crimea had a convincing pretext, but attacking the Baltics doesn't, meaning the public would be uniquely angry about a Baltic invasion, even if they liked previous ones. So this also responds directly to any empirics the AF gives by differentiating the Baltics from them. It also sets a neg up for turns about NATO giving Putin a pretext to invade by saying that a world with NATO aggression as a provocation is the only world in which an invasion would be popular enough to launch in the first place. So now we'll move on to responses specifically on the uniqueness of Russian troops accumulating on the border. First, Bandow 17 explains that capability does not equal intent, concluding that Russia's military is only meant to deter US coercion. Majumdar 19 explains that most Russian militarization in the Baltics has been defensive, with the type of troops they deploy heavily reliant on what NATO deploys. Our opponent basically gives you one cherry-picked piece of evidence of a single offensive weapon, but not the big picture. So lots of teams will use the idea that Russia has massive military buildup as proof that Russia is about to invade. Obviously, we know that's not true because having troops doesn't mean you're going to use them in an offensive manner, which is why this response is really good in clearing it up. Be careful about cards that post-date Majumdar though. So that's it for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as well as comment down below any questions you have or what you want to see next. Again, a file with all the responses written out and cards cut can be accessed in the link in the description, so if you want free prep, be sure to take a look. You'll also want to be shared on the document, which you will be if you fill out the form, because I'll be updating the list of responses throughout the topic. And finally, I also want to encourage you to check out my previous video on weighing on the Septober topic, where you can basically access even more free prep. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.